I hate introductions because if they're too good, then I'm going to disappoint you. Anyhow, you've gotten a little taste of some of the excitement of working in our Public Affairs and Religious Liberty Department. And I don't know if it was made clear to you, but public affairs is a whole lot broader than religious liberty. Public affairs in some ways is tied up to presenting our church and dealing with all of the interests of the community beyond perhaps a more narrow thing about protecting our practice of religion for ourselves and for everybody. Before I talk a little bit more, I do want to test your patience just by 2.5 minutes. You probably haven't seen a little we call it a promo video for this year's Liberty campaign. But it illustrates what you've just heard, how an individual can reach out and make a difference, in this case, among the legislators in this state. I preached this morning, and I've preached a couple of times lately, on witness, because it's the theme of our presentation this year. I have a personal burden that our Religious Liberty Department has been its own worst enemy with members sometimes in minimalizing what we do, maximizing the information to you on court cases, which I believe most people glaze over a bit when they're given all the legal technicalities, and especially if you've not had problems in the workplace yourself. But the larger issue of how we can witness and what religious liberty means in the big picture and for Adventists as we move toward the end of time, that's, I think, something relevant that should touch each of us. So if you can show that, I'd appreciate it. Our liberty theme this year is witness. That's just not a word, that's a reality for religious liberty. Let me give you an example.
I am blessed to have opportunities to witness even in a public environment. Being a chief consultant at the California State Legislature, I have found it to be very rewarding and being called to witness at such a time as this. And one of the instruments that I use to witness is none other than Liberty Magazine. Prior to being a chief consultant, I also have served as a legislative director, and during that time, I would actually buy several subscriptions to Liberty Magazine and send them to various members of the legislature. Unbeknown to them, as I interacted with them, sometimes they would communicate to me the fact that they were reading the magazines. Some periodicals I would notice that were on my boss's desk, and she would tell me, "Oh, I've read this article, this is amazing." And I would just get so tickled knowing the fact that I was the one that had sent those magazines to them. We are called to be the light. We are called to witness in this time, especially when we know we're living in the last days. And I think sometimes we believe that religious liberty is only about, oh, I can't work on Sabbath. But there's so many other facets of religious liberty. And when we witness, even by just paying $6 to allow someone to have a Liberty magazine, it's opening up their eyes, their ears, their minds to realizing that religious liberty is so much more. And they can find that when they pick up Liberty Magazine and read a wealth of faith-based, scholastically driven articles.
I think you can see that for Janice, witness is a dynamic reality, but it's something that you and I can experience, that's given to us all as we join with this religious liberty imperative. This time of the year is your opportunity to reconsider your commitment to funding Liberty Magazine and other activities of our Religious Liberty Department. And I want you in a special way this year to think, how can I be a part of this great gospel commission proclaiming liberty throughout the land? Thank you for your ongoing financial and prayer commitment. Well, I hope that hit the spot with you, and keep that in mind in the next few months. In fact, from now on. Because Liberty Magazine is doing a great work. It precedes me, precedes any of us. It's been around for 110 plus years, and before that, before a short break, back to Ellen White's time and Alonzo T. Jones and our pioneer story and their big scare, if you like, at a national Sunday law, which Ellen White and Alonzo T. Jones thought was it. And that's why Jones got up in 1888 and preached for revival and preparation for this crisis. Who knows if we're right on such a moment again? It impressed me, I think it was last year when I was sharing in an afternoon meeting some interesting facts and figures about the times we live in, and an older gentleman sitting on the second row out there in the room that I was in called out to me rather plaintively. He says, tell us when we should be afraid. And it sort of bothered me, and I said, well, you should never be afraid. Perfect love casts out fear, and we're to be forewarned, and we're forewarned and we're forearmed against all of these problems. It's not so much that we're an early warning system to scare you. I don't know what you do when you're scared. That's not a good way to get a true spiritual response. But you should be informed to know the times. And the Bible says, and to redeem the days because the days are evil. These are bad times. And as I was sitting there, I was thinking about many things. That's my problem. My mind races. And I was thinking of the times we live in. I can tell you, there's no question that right now, especially in Washington, and I believe what Dennis says in California and Sacramento, we have open doors to us like never before. It's not hard for us to get in and to talk to these different politicians, be in different meetings and consultations and seminars where they're there and they listen to us, right? But it doesn't necessarily mean that these are good times for civil and indeed religious liberties in this country. There are many, many markers of trouble ahead. But the irony is, and when I first started with this job, I used to quote Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. He says it was the best of times and the worst of times. And he was describing the times of the French Revolution in Europe. A cataclysm was descending on France and by extension many other countries. And arguably it's never ceased. We're living in a time of revolution. Ellen White said that the whole world just before the end of time will be like scenes will be like those of the French Revolution. And before this meeting began, I was sharing a meeting I attended in 2006. Odd sort of a meeting. It was a right-wing policy planning group, and I was a guest of the board. How that happened, I can't even really believe it myself. But the top general in the US told us at great length over breakfast how they've got plans for martial law in this country. These are not normal times. With Liberty Magazine, something changed for me on 9/11. Just as a procedure, I used to get the articles together and write my editorial and send it through the system. But from 9/11 on, I realized the gap between putting the articles into the system and then it going on the press is too great. The world changes several times, often. And so I write the editorial and drop it in at the last possible minute. And I've thought a lot about 9/11. There are many hiccups and points in history where you can see rapid changes coming, and Ellen White says the last movements will be rapid ones. But certainly 9/11, when we're talking about civil liberties generally, and by extension some religious liberties in this country, was a significant moment. But I want to launch off by sharing something with you from Ellen White that links to 9/11. I can remember the day very well. I was sitting in my office, I think editing. I hope I wasn't sleeping. No, I'm just joking. But anyhow, I was awakened literally when Clifford Goldstein, my predecessor, who's a bit like my father, he's always sort of switched on, and he came bounding in, which he literally does, right? Came bounding into my room. He says, switch on your TV. He says, switch on your TV. There's a plane just flown into one of the Twin Towers in New York. See what's happening. So I turned on, I had a TV in my office. I turned it on, and Cliff stayed for a few hours, and during the day other people came and went because we saw the second plane hit, and like millions of others in this country and across the world, I was transfixed all that day by what happened. But while we were watching it, first of all I said to Cliff, I said, the building's not going to fall. I said, they're built to withstand that. And I remember myself as a kid seeing a newsreel of a 4-engine bomber flying into the Empire State in New York. And a lot of damage. The plane was destroyed, but it didn't bring down the Empire State, so I was pretty confident it wasn't going to come down. But as you know, both buildings came down. And I will never forget the sound of the crowd. Whoa, like just a cry of horror. And while we were watching that, I said to Cliff, there's a quote from Ellen White that always sounded to me very much like describing this event. But it stuck in my mind because I believe I found a mistake in Ellen White's writings. And he's, what are you talking about? I said, there's a problem. There's an incomplete sentence or wrong words. So I told him about it, and he says, go check with the White Estate, which I did, and they stuck to their guns. No, it's correct. And I waited a bit, and then next time I checked with the White Estate, they said, you're actually right. We went back to the handwritten version that it comes from, and Ellen White did write something different. Let me read you the quote. And there are similar ones that people noticed on that day, but this one is from Manuscript Releases, Volume 11. And nobody much picked up on it because she didn't say it was New York. She doesn't know where it was. This is what she wrote. In the night, I thought, in a room, but not in my own house. I was in a city where I knew not. And I heard expression after expression, period. Does that sound like a sentence to you? Expression of what? Something missing, or else those words are wrong. What she actually wrote was, I heard explosion after explosion. And there were two impacts. She says, I rose up quickly in bed and saw from my windows large balls of fire. Jetting out were sparks. Again, jetting out were sparks in the form of arrows. And buildings, plural, were being consumed. And in a very few minutes, the entire block of buildings was falling. 3 buildings fell that day very quickly. One was brought down, we know, as the owner of, Trade Center 7. I saw him on TV that day. He said it was brought down with pre-placed explosives. Very interesting. She says, in a few minutes, the entire block of buildings was falling, and the screeching and mournful groans came distinctly to my ears. I cried out in my raised position to learn what was happening. Where am I? And where are our family circle? Then I awoke. But I could not tell where I was, for I was in another place than home. And this is the reason now I'm sharing it with you. This is what she said. I said, Oh Lord, where am I? And what shall I do? It was a voice that spoke. Be not afraid, nothing shall harm you. And more and more I'm convinced, as well as having spiritual security and vibrancy and be Bible-based and just regenerating ourselves into what Adventists, I think, once were, we need to keep in mind that this is not a time for terror for us. We're not to be afraid. This is the punishments coming on the world. Not all direct punishments. Not everything comes from God. But as Ellen White again often said, cause and effect. And many things that are in process in the world have very foolish and evil antecedents. And I know President Obama's minister was caught out pretty badly for his statements, but he was not totally wrong in talking about chickens coming home to roost. And nor is it quite right to see 9/11 as an attack on the US. It was an attack on globalism. Why did they choose the World Trade Centers? We're living in a time of rebellion and upheaval against the established order. World War I, remember, began because of anarchists who were against all rule. And we are again facing a time of anarchy, unhinged violence. And how do we react to this? With fear or with redoubled certainty to spread the word while we can? To me, that is the dynamic of religious liberty. We have religious liberty. God gave it to us. That's the byproduct of all that heaven had in mind and that Jesus came to bring. You are free. And he says, and if the Son sets you free, you're free indeed. So neither this country nor any other country can give you or take away what God has already given. It can make it easier or harder to put that into practice, that's to be sure. So our goal is to proclaim the liberty, the God-given liberty we have, which is essentially synonymous with the Gospel Commission. So I don't see religious liberty as a sidelight to what we're about. It's central, and particularly a church that was so prophetically oriented. As we talk about religious liberty, of necessity, it has to remind us of the times we live in and the evidences for the soon return of Christ. I want to do, again, I think this morning I mentioned it, that I'm guilty. Every time I read, I know that I can hear my wife telling me, don't read, it's the worst thing you can do. But I'll risk it. I want to read you the last editorial for Liberty magazine. It's not printed yet. I just wrote it a couple of days ago as an intro to just a few comments that I'll make about the times we live in. By the way, I need to make a comment also that occurred to me while I was sitting there. There's a lot of talk about Iran lately, and I think a lot of it is just paranoia. I remember when I was about 19, my father took us on a world tour, which was amazing. Before she died, my mother used to say, how did we visit so many countries? How did your father manage it? But among many, many other countries, we went to Iran. And apart from looking around Tehran a lot, which reminded me a lot of Paris, we went out to an Adventist camp meeting. I think it was in Isfahan or somewhere, but quite a few hours out of Tehran. And I don't know at this moment about Adventists, but we had a lot of Adventists in Iran. So don't fall into this thing about thinking it's the evil empire. They're a vicious, horrible crew, and we need to bomb them as soon as possible. This is falling into the ways of the world. Remember that there is dignity and different cultures all around the world, and for Adventists, there may be brothers and sisters, I'm sure there are in Iran. But what came to my mind, and I think we saw it on that visit, there's the tomb of Queen Esther in Iran. They still have it today. And remember at the time of Queen Esther, which was, of course, way after the original captivity, by that time, they had a fairly benign king. The Jews were well integrated, had to have been. Here, Esther has become the queen by sort of a beauty pageant that we might not give the nod to today. And her cousin is the gatekeeper, a pretty important job, just as Nehemiah was the cupbearer in the other story. These are close to power. These were not easily given jobs. So they had great influence, great access. And yet think about it, at that very moment when these two figures, and certainly others I'm sure, were right in the inner circle, you would think they had security and peace. Then an enemy arose that sought to absolutely destroy all of them. And of course the Jews to this day celebrate Purim. It's one of their greatest festivals. And put it in your mind, right now, there's good evidence to look beyond the simple fact that we have a president, and I'm going to read something on that now, who speaks very well of religious liberty. Whether or not he personally has great knowledge of that dynamic, I think it's an open question at best. But we can easily see there are forces in this country that are both unconstitutional and anti-libertarian as far as religious liberty is concerned. And the way I best describe what we are already in the middle of is not a great flowering of religious liberty. We are seeing the charging ahead of religious entitlement. For certain religious views, it's never been better. But those same ones that are pushing for religious entitlement would, as one of the framers of the Constitution said, if you give a sect sort of a privileged position, what's to prevent that sect turning around and persecuting other sects? That is the logical consequence of the government entitling one form of religion over another. But I wanted to share this for no other reason than to get your feedback, because the presses could yet be stopped. I've been an editor long enough to have that, I've had it attempted on me. And in Australia, I informed one of the editors in the middle of the Ford thing about the whole deal, and he went off half-cocked, and they did stop the press on him. But this is what I wrote, and I called it The Kingdom. On one level, events of late have a certain air of déjà vu for me. As a young man, I followed the events leading up to the decision to impeach President Nixon. The storyline was a bit like a Jean le Carre spy novel, involving as it did money payoffs by courier, a coincidental plane crash, the mad wife of one of the principals, and the incredible stretching routine that erased vital evidence from tapes we only belatedly realized existed and held a record of everything. No need for redactions or summaries from that point on. Those that are as old as me will remember some of this. And then the man that I so looked up to, President Nixon, he of the shady McCarthy past, redeemed by rapprochement with China, now weeping about his mother and waving with crooked smile as he flew away from the presidency and a sure conviction, but pardoned by his successor in a deal that may have been charitable but ran against the spirit of the Constitution that forbade the president to use his pardon powers against impeachment. Read the Constitution, it actually says that. And not so long ago, another president ran the gauntlet of impeachment for, if not the high crime of personal immorality, then for lying and perjury after the fact. Amazingly, it had only a positive effect on his popularity, which makes me think that these events have finally become more political theatre than serious legal proceedings for the good of the Republic. The sobering reality is that massive changes and abrogations of national norms are at play. Going into the whole event, we were expected to either close ranks with either of the particular party lines, or if not, then be reduced to slack-jawed fascination at the kabuki theatre of the absurd. It didn't help that a mad or careless lawyer provided comic relief to a serious question. It didn't help that, like siblings caught out, much of the argument was deflected to, but he did this, so why am I in trouble? Only about halfway through this tawdry tale did we get to the real issue at play. It is one that has massive implications for the survival of a free republic as we know it. And to focus my general horror on something this magazine cares deeply about, there are clear implications for how religion and religious liberty might fare under the emerging paradigm. That moment was on display when Professor Alan Dershowitz gave his legal 2 cents worth on the central story. Even if a president uses his powers for personal ends, opined the legal gadabout, as long as he believes that there is a state interest involved, it is okay. Convenient. And surely so wrong that the framers of the Constitution, the fathers of the Republic, the men who rejected the relative autocracy of the British Crown, the men who wrote so much about balance of powers and the limits of power entrusted by the people, so wrong that the howl of derision at such a statement should have shaken the nation. But very little pushback, even as the professor tried to redefine his statements on later TV programs. The reality is that this was merely an MTV version of a whole philosophy of power known as the Unitary Principle or theory of executive power. Presidential power. It is hard to pin down, but it describes what amounts to kingly power. Years ago, during the confirmation of Attorney General Gonzales, he was asked if the president was bound by the laws of Congress, and he said no. A senator asked him if a president was bound by the laws passed by the people's representatives and signed into law by himself or a predecessor. Again, no, sir. In a hyperbolic moment, a presidential candidate joked that he could shoot someone in the street and get away with it. Amazingly, presidential lawyers actually took the same stance recently in front of a New York State judge. My point is not so much that our good president or any successor might actually do such a mischievous thing, but to illustrate how far we have drifted from a constitutional norm. The partisanship we all decry is actually making this precipitous shift and, of course, then making it more dangerous. This president has gone out of his way to speak well of religious liberty, and I pray that he continues to do so. Liberty has reprinted some of his statements and actions by his administration. We are thankful that he is adhering to a founding principle so succinctly expressed in the First Amendment to the Constitution, one of the amendments required by the states as a condition of ratification of the Constitution. But true religious liberty is on less than solid, unshifting ground if it depends on the smile of a president described by the Unitary Principle of power. Christianity in a 2,000-year history went from a growing group of persecuted followers of Jesus Christ to an often persecuting state-allied power, and following a reformation that came at a time of flowering personal freedom, arrived at its present dynamic state of openness and charity. A big part of that success story, especially in this new world, was the removal of state control and an assumption that religion is a private matter of conscience. It was the power of a Roman emperor and assorted European kings that channeled religion into the ditch of persecution. Unfortunately, much of our present dynamic seems to be repeating that model of history. Constantine championed Christianity without knowing much about it. He required doctrinal unity, and the church obliged by regulating itself into conformity. Who cannot see that today, with the unprecedented alliance between a certain politically active Christian faction and a very secular president determined to help them, that we have the beginnings of the Constantine model? If the presidency continues its for some time now drift toward absolutism. That First Amendment mandates that the state is to make no law establishing religion. Creative lawyers and even people of faith anxious to advance their cause might dance around this requirement, but separation of church and state was the Protestant ideal and was the aim of the founders. By way of the Puritans who railed against a state church and the king's use and misuse of it, the framers put this in the amendment along with instructions that the free exercise of religion is to be protected. I know that increasing numbers of Bible-believing patriots have begun to imagine a certain parallel between a godly nation and the way faith was protected in the Old Testament days when the glory hovered over the temple and God spoke good laws through his prophets. It is an honorable image, but cannot work absent real glory and real prophets. And it is worth remembering that the whole thing went wrong when the people wished for a king like the other nations. That first king, Saul, was a man of much stature and promise, but as the prophet Samuel warned, he usurped justice and built up his own power. And even in a theocracy, he was not to assume religious prerogatives. When Saul did that and acted as a priest, the prophet pronounced that his kingdom was taken from him. I fear that if we in this secular republic lose sight of our founding principles, forget the constitutional guidelines, and advance religion by fiat power, we might experience not virtue, but decline. Food for thought, I hope. These are interesting times. And you know, with talking to Adventists, we've discussed ahead of time, it's fraught with peril because these are serious political times. The battle lines are drawn, and many in our own church are vocal and belligerent proponents of a certain view. That's their right. This is a free country. But I do hope that in this advancing situation that Adventists look again to their Bibles, look again to the history that we have in our own writings, and just test some of these principles against the advancing norms. I've for years, in fact, well, I'll give you the background of it. For years after 9/11, on regular occasions, I had elderly couples come up to me. Oddly enough, it was always couples. They had an accent, and it turned out they were from Germany, and they told me they were really troubled because so much of what they were already seeing shortly after 9/11 reminded them of what they had lived through in their youth. We don't see that, most of us, because we're in the slowly boiling pot. It takes someone coming from outside, and I have the slight advantage. I came as a young man to Australia, and I sort of still got even though I've lived here longer than most people have been alive, I still sort of compare it to something. It gives you a little bit more objectivity, but it's very easy in any environment, and I've seen it around the world, even in communist countries, unless there was in-your-face persecution and someone was politically dissatisfied, most people, even in those countries, would say they lived in the freest, greatest country in the world. We could laugh at that. No, it's not so. But we're in an echo chamber, and when you're only comparing yourself by certain news outlets or your neighbors or whatever, it's easy to get a bounce back and reinforce whatever view you're pushing. It may not be right at all. We can look at North Korea and see those poor, deluded, manipulated people, chanting their praise and crying their tears when the great leader dies or his father dies. It's pitiful, but that's human nature. That's how we are. And my end appeal before we go to questions is Seventh-day Adventists, with so much clarified for us, we need to clear our mind and look to heavenly realities and valid spiritual comparisons, and not this echo chamber or the boombox that we live in. The Bible does say that perilous times will come that will deceive, if possible, the very elect. I like to think that we're the very elect, but yet we're deceivable. And I think if we keep ourselves grounded with facts, if we keep ourselves motivated by the charge that was given to Adventism, God will fill up the difference. He's promised great strength, great power, great protection. And he's even promised discernment, but it doesn't come out of the blue. If we're feeding ourselves with the wrong point of reference, we surely will not get discernment. Even Solomon, who prayed for it and got it for a while, with many women and much abuse of his people, he lost that discernment, as he said, to find the depths of evil and darkness. That's where he ended up. We decided to have, short or long, but a question and answer time. Is there anything that's been said by anybody or anything that's already on your mind that you wanted to discuss or ask us? We don't know all the answers, but I often joke after a number of afternoon meetings, I think I sort of know all the questions. I know what you're likely to ask. But certainly there's a lot that we can clarify for people who haven't heard how our church is reacting to some of these issues.
Yes, has not the scripture outlined this for us? As of the days of Noah, so shall it be in the coming of the Son of Man.
Right. And what was the days of Noah? Marrying and giving in marriage, and eating and drinking.
Well, the antediluvian. The antediluvian, the Bible says that they lived for hundreds of years. And God saw that their thoughts and their hearts were evil continuously.
Yeah.
So, how much words can we get? The Holy Spirit is guiding us and influencing us and teaching us to have an abiding consciousness of the person of God, of the loveliness of God, of the power of God. And in this kind of environment, as the Holy Spirit upholds us and guides us and influences us, we have the opportunity to have no fear.
Right, that's what I'm trying to say. Do you have a question? Or this
Well,
a nice reinforcing statement.
You said a response.
Yes.
I'm responding.
Good.
You're
reminding me that
thank you for letting me share.
A few years ago, Gorbachev, who's still alive, I think, but he must be getting old, but after he'd left office as ruler of the Soviet Union, he got involved with ecology. And I remember him saying, this next time around, there will be no ark to save us. Well, maybe not an ark, but there's a deliverance. But it's very important to me that the whole world, even a little bit in the US, but in a rather perverse way, this administration, in denying global warming or global change, maybe is a better way to put it, are actually thwarting a papal initiative. The Pope, I believe, has put everything on the table for his end game to unite the world in saving the planet from environmental degradation. If you've read the document Laudato Si, I think you'll understand it. It's an incredible document addressed to the whole world, not just to Catholics, Christians, or whatever. It says it plainly. This is a global concern. It says the earth is like our sister, a younger sister. She's dying. She's crying out in agony, and we have to save her or else we'll die with her. Those were pretty high stakes. And he says, in order to save the situation, we need to recognize again the rhythms inscribed in nature by the Creator. What rhythm do you know about? It says, along those lines, rest on the seventh-day Sabbath as required in the Bible is important. It says not just for man, but for animals, and he gets into the Jubilee principle and so on. It repeats over and over. It's a Sabbath document. And it ends the document by saying, as we journey toward the eternal Sabbath. Trouble is, as you'd expect, midway the Pope says that in keeping the Eucharistic Sunday, we are fulfilling the Sabbath requirement. But here, as a matter of global survival, we have to worship on the day the Lord has given, Sunday. You're going to hold out against that? Those are pretty high stakes. And Ellen White speaks to this. She says, the people say that, we're moving on to the temporal millennium. We're going to save everything. And here, you're a little people and you're holding out. Why? Better have a good reason. It's not just enough, I believe, anymore to quote proof texts on the Sabbath from the Bible. It's a bit bigger than that now. I do think a huge part of the answer is for us to be, as the Bible says, or I think Ellen White says, loving and lovable Christians. We need to be alive and active and exemplifying Christ's love. And we need to be aware of Bible truth. Anyhow, sorry to get off a track a bit, but you reminded me of that.
Elder, I have a question to ask. How do you balance? How do you bring balance? I mean, I've been an Adventist pastor now for more than 38 years. And of course, having grown up Seventh-day Adventist, there was a time when I was a child that the fear was that one day we're going to have to run from the Catholics. And how do you balance where we are at in the world today, with an understanding of what prophecy says is going to happen and what we know we should do to prevent some of this? In other words, you're an advocate of religious liberty for the Seventh-day Adventist Church in North America. And while that's good, where's the balance between preventing some of these things from happening and just letting them happen?
We're an advocate of religious liberty for Adventists along with anyone else. You can believe anything or not believe the lot. It's all or nothing. And already in this country, admittedly, they've given cause for it, but Islam is excluded, and certain more marginal religious practices are frowned upon and not legally encouraged. We're already on the track. Once you start restricting anybody's faith, it's a matter of time till the wheel turns and someone else gets restricted. And worse, governments, not much in this country, but the dynamic appeals to all humans. Governments have traditionally played one religion off against another. I remember our first U.S. ambassador for religious freedom used to come to our Washington, what do they call it, the Washington Round Table. All of the religious liberty and church and civil rights groups in Washington got together, and for a while they met at the GC. And he brought his son along, who has now taken over from him and his advocacy group. And he'd come back from, I think, Azerbaijan, and he says, great news, he says, we've gotten the government to agree to release and authorize, and he named 3 little religions. And I said, you just fell into their trap. Now you're on their side, you're calling them a great thing, and yet they're restricting a whole bunch of other religions. You can't rest with such an attitude until all religions are free, because they play one off against the other. It's a classic Machiavellian technique, and it was a technique of communism. So we need to be very careful, or else we fall into the mistake, and I know you meant it well, but the mistake of the religious right. They talk of religious liberty, they mean it for themselves, not for other people. They're not greatly moved by other people's faith. We need to have a tender conscience for all people, deluded as they may be. Right? I mean, this morning I made a mention of Mormons, and I find that's just the most foolish religion on the face of the planet. But they're wonderful people, and they have as much right to believe something their conscience draws them to as you and I do. So what's your bottom line point? How do we push back against this?
No, I'm just wondering, so where is the balance between preventing what we know is going to happen and just letting it happen?
Well, we can't prevent it, and I do believe that Liberty magazine inadvertently have encouraged the idea that we're holding back the inevitable. And I've heard some people say it. I've heard pastors say, it's all coming. Why are we fighting the inevitable? Why are we trying to push back against evil generally or against restrictions on liberty of conscience? Has anyone got an idea why you would do such a thing? We're under the gospel commission. We're told to spread the good word to everyone. And if we allow evil people to push back and restrict that opportunity, people are being cut out of the opportunity. If we gain any space by pushing back legally, it should be space that allows the gospel to be spread more freely. Other than that, I cannot see any logic why God would ever delay an inevitable or get us out of any pickle. The whole purpose of this is for God's mercy to be spread far and wide. And he will, what does it say? He's delaying, not willing that any should perish. But at some point, if we're not doing anything, and I need to be careful on this, because one way or another God will accomplish it. But if at the moment when we believe that a certain responsibility rests with us and we don't fill it, God will either do it some extraordinary way, or worse, as Jesus said to the Jews who believed they were eternally God's people, raise up from the stones. You know, we've got to be a little bit careful as a church. Yes, it was told to us what the remnant will do, what the Adventist movement will accomplish. But it doesn't mean God's going to do it regardless of our inactivity. The only out for us, it's a movement, not a church. The church should embrace the movement. But it's not, and we're not saved by organization. We're saved by those who exemplify this ongoing charge of faith right through to the end of time. I'm sorry to get on the hobby horse. The question? But back to it again. I'm really sure that some Adventists, I'll talk about myself. I remember when I was about 12 years old, I had a dream of the second coming. And I don't know what was playing on my conscience or what I'd eaten the night before. I have no idea on that. But in my dream, it was the second coming, and it was very mechanical. It was like a set. I could see the rollers rolling back the sky. It was sort of a Monty Python thing, and maybe that was the influence. And the trumpets, I saw them raising up and blowing. And I remember thinking, I must look happy. I must look happy.
Nothing wrong with that.
That's sort of what we've got. The idea to tough it out, or even as I thought as a young person, I know there's plenty of Adventists think this. You know, I know these things are happening, but, you know, I'm comfortable enough now. When I get a certain advance warning, then I'll shape up and be ready. I mean, and that's a very dangerous thing. It's not impossible, but it's unlikely. If certainly where we are now in history, if not enough has happened to convict you that we're in prophetic times, quite apart from just abnormal times, it's easy to prove from a matter of history that we're at a hinge point of empire and world history. You know, the rapid expansion and the modernization that the US experienced, we've peaked. You know, China is rising. It's like Rome. The legions are going to this corner and that corner of the empire, and at home the senators are fighting among themselves, and the imperial wannabes are aspiring. Things are shaky. But all of that aside, it's clearly a prophetic moment. And you would have to be living in a cuckoo land to think with any great certainty that life will go on as it has been before. In fact, I've told people in afternoon meetings for years that neither you nor I can know when the close of probation comes and the Lord's coming. You know, no time prophecy after 1888. Ellen White's very plain on that. But I say, I'll stake my life on one thing. The world that you know is about to pass away. And in many ways already has. Think about it. When I came back to Pacific Press in '85, computers were just appearing. The little Mac Plus, paid $2,500 for it. It didn't have as much computing power as a $1 calculator, by the way, which is what we had when we went to the moon. Think about where we are now. I mean, you've got surveillance drones, you're being tracked by your phone. I mean, it's just on and on. We're already in a more radical change. and all the ramifications that go with it than the Industrial Revolution. But it's accelerating. It's accelerating, as it will, because the electronic era particularly is a logarithmic shift. The problems of overpopulation, of environmental change, of economic collapse. You know, we live in a funny farm time. Money is not valuable. It only is money because people think it is. And the Bible says that in 1 hour, the merchants of this world, standing afar off from the system that we have, are going to wail that their wealth have disappeared. It's easily possible today. In fact, not possible, likely. It's just a matter of when. So this is the time that God will show his hand, I believe. And of course, Satan is going to do his worst too. But this is an exciting moment. My father, when I told him this stuff, used to invariably say, "Isn't it exciting? The Lord is about to come."
Here.
Yeah,
Yeah, I almost forgot what I was going to ask you.
sorry. Long answers, and I'm sorry.
This quarter, we've been studying Daniel. I came to the conclusion that Daniel, even though the forces of evil were against him, he was still practicing religious freedom because it was given to him by God.
Right, well, that's what I tried to say before.
I know. Now, historically, religious freedom given by men has never lasted very long. Religious freedom given by God seems to ever last, forever, right? Question. As a church, are we trying to put more emphasis on the understanding of religious liberty given by God to us? Or are we going to try to fight the status quo, the system, trying to lobby for laws and regulations as if religious liberty came from men? Where are we drawing the line as a church? You being the chief leader on this area, I want to ask you a question. What is your prospect?
Well, I have a view very much like yours.
I'd appreciate it if you could share with us.
We need to see the distinction. And I really respect the U.S. Constitution, which nobody reads. Go read it. I just know it's almost unknown in this country. I listen to the government discussion and that, and even the legislators seem abysmally unaware of the Constitution. And most people, if they have any sort of resonance with what they think is the Constitution, it's invariably the Declaration of Independence. And to be honest, a lot of the Constitution is dull as dust, but it's very important. And there's wacky stuff in there. There's dollar amounts that you can be sued under law, which, of course, with the hundreds of years gone by, it's sort of arcane. But there's things I just noticed the other day. It says specifically that the president has the power to pardon, but not in matters of impeachment, which means presidential and other impeachments. The Congress is to deal with trade between nations, not the president. You wouldn't know that from today, right? But I've told people, and we need to defend people in the workplace. We need to lobby the government and so on, if for nothing else than to make them aware of what we think, not as pressure tactics, which if it's on that level, we can't lobby to the same degree that any other large churches can or other organizations. So by definition, we can never compete on an even footing. But I believe we have an obligation to communicate to them, to interact and so on. And a lot of what the Religious Liberty and Pile Department does is just ongoing contacts, discussions, sharing. It's a way of witnessing, after all, if it's done right. Not, if it's a matter of just getting excited about shaking the Pope's hand, that could be very bad. But if it's a matter to explain even to the Catholic Church what Adventists believe, fine. But I do believe that we need to get away from thinking that our liberty is the government's gift and not God's. And I've told people in religious liberty, we look at the Constitution, we're constantly analyzing it and using it to defend our position, and I think we're on pretty safe ground, but it's still very likely at the end of the day, since it's a flawed human document, it's not divine writ, that maybe it can't save us and grant continued freedoms in the way we might like. It's a pretty good effort by fallible human beings informed by British and history and in the church level, the Reformation, but it's not perfect. I mean, by definition, it's not perfect because we have amendments that sorted out the issue of slavery, and of course we flip-flopped on prohibition and so on. But it can be changed. But it's not a bad thing. But don't substitute it for the Bible. And your point's very correct, I think. And, none of us can speak for the church. I don't even believe Ted Wilson can speak for the church. We're not a command economy church. We have levels of responsibility. But I think at any given time you can know the mood of the church, and at the moment it's not good. And as far as what we officially believe, it's written down. We're not likely to change that anytime soon. But neither is the U.S. likely to pull the Constitution out under glass and scribble on it. As this country repudiates the Constitution, which is the word Ellen White uses, I believe it'll sit nicely and pristinely under glass in Washington, and we'll bow down to the principle as we go our own way. We just need to make sure as Adventists we don't do that with God's word and what we're told as a church.
Yeah. So thank you for giving us a general view. Thank you. Thank you for giving us a general view of where we are today. And I can understand, just making a little brief comment about what the gentleman was talking about. I can see where the confusion comes about who gives us the liberties? Because nowadays there are so many, the sense of entitlement. The sense of entitlement has grown so much that the only instrument that people have that has been designed, it's legislation. They have to legislate continuously to support this amount of new entitlements. This is how I feel. This is how I think. And all of that has to be legislated. So eventually there is this confusion, and people on secular societies start thinking about the government as their God. This is the God that is giving me my liberties, whereas we know this other God that has given us the Bible, the Bible-based idea of freedom, and it's not based on everything goes, which is the days of Noah. I'm tying up with what the gentleman said. No, there are principles and there are values. But anyways, what I wanted was to hear, since we already understand that the general atmosphere on the country is what it is, can you give some specifics as to how close are we? For example, I know about the comment of Secretary of State, Pompeo, about wanting to have the wall of separation, down. I just would like to leave today with some specifics, and I'm pretty sure that everybody here wants to have a taste of that.
Well, it depends. I can bring plenty of evidence. In fact, I sometimes think I scare people too much by telling stuff that's just all negative, because there is positive. But, you can make a checklist, and I'm glad you mentioned Pompeo. And when this administration first started, the Attorney General, what was the first Attorney General? Sessions, Jeff Sessions. I think it was the same day he was confirmed. He said publicly he did not believe in the separation of church and state, which is problematic on two levels, both for religious freedom itself, or the practice of religion, but as a sign of their constitutionality of public officials. To breeze off such a foundational principle is quite troubling. I can put a checklist. To me, it's a matter of I wrote once talking about lines of causality. You can sort of talk about the Catholic Church, but the Catholic Church is not directly the one that's predicted by the word given to Adventists. It's not the one that's going to directly persecute us in this country. It's conservative Protestants. But they are working closely with Rome, and Rome is setting the initiative or the agenda in the world of religion now. When I was young, the dynamic was the Catholic Church was working vigorously for sort of reunification, and the World Council of Churches, the World Council of Churches. That was their goal, and we stayed away from it. We didn't want to join, and we didn't want to be part of ecumenism, as we called it then. But the model has changed now. The Catholic Church is not overtly seeking to bring back all of the separated churches and even non-Christian churches. They're seeking to be the chairman of the board of all faith groups, and it's pretty much a done deal. About the only holdout that I can see of any consequence, and you hardly ever hear about it, is the Eastern Orthodox Church. But that's the grand split in Christendom around the year, was it 1000 or 1100? You know, it's nearly 1,000 years ago. They split over two very important things: the primacy of the Pope, which they never accepted, and questions on the nature of Christ. Not much beyond that. And it's huge. Just over a year ago, at the first, I guess it was about a year and a half ago, at the first ever Trump administration ministerial for religious liberty, I attended the section put on by the Catholic Church and their supporters. Very interesting. And there were a lot of Eastern Orthodox priests there, and I talked to them. I said, how are you going on unification? We're nowhere near it. We're not going to do what Rome says. I was surprised, the antagonism. And I was also surprised at what there were many legislators there. There was the ambassador from the US to the Vatican, which is Newt Gingrich's wife. I'm trying to remember her first name. Newt was with her there. There were a number of government ministers. There were a number of senators and congressmen, Catholics. And they said very plainly that they want American Protestants and those that share these views on religion to police themselves. They said they'll do it for themselves. They said, we don't want to be accused of persecuting anyone. It's in their mind, very plain, that the Catholic Church in the past forced things. But I do believe that you know, they're good people. I have no problem with any of the Catholics that I've dealt with. And for all I know, they're closer to the kingdom personally than me. I mean, there's wonderful Christians in the Catholic arena. But as an organization, it stands for certain things. It has a certain sense of entitlement and superiority to other beliefs, and it's going to act on them one day. A story that I've told many times, as I was listening, I was attending a Catholic one-day religious liberty event at Catholic University, and Cardinal Dolan, the head of the Catholic bishops in the US, was speaking, and I was right in front of him, so I could almost see the back of his retina. I was so close, and he got preoccupied as he was talking, and then he stopped and he said, you know, there was a time when Roman Catholics would not speak this way, not have spoken this way about religious liberty. He said, we once held that error has no rights. And then he, you know, all happy, just finished and came and sat down next to me. And we talked for a bit, but they reassembled for the next session. There was a given title. There were 3 people up front that were to present. Before they could start, people started calling out, what does he mean? What's the cardinal talking about? And they had to tutor Catholics on what their church originally believed and had put it in abeyance because of Vatican II. And Vatican II, you know, Adventists used to suspect everything in the Catholic Church. I believe it was whether or not God brought it, but it was a refreshing breeze into an absolutist church. And it's given an opportunity for many Catholics to study the Bible again. They were not encouraged before this present time. They have services in English very often, so it's demystified their religion. They're thinking for themselves. This is a little moment of openness. And that group had to be told about Vatican II and the central document called Dignitatis Humanae, the dignity of man. And for the first time, really, ever after the apostolic era, but the first time in the papacy, they said that every human being has the right to choose their religion, to be free of any coercion, and to give up and to deny any religion they want. There's no business of a church or a state to tell them. That's revolutionary. But I can tell you, and they didn't tell the Catholic audience, that within the Vatican particularly, there are many, including the last previous 2 popes and this one a bit, who have rethought it and do not like Vatican II and would roll it back gladly. So one day, the Catholic Church will revert. And I think Ellen White had it right. She's Rome's conciliatory where she's weak. When she's strong, she'll be overbearing. And they feel their strength coming back. And I remember when the Pope came and spoke. The microphone go? Oh. Our church didn't seem to react. The Adventist Review did not have an article on it. Just amazing. I came back from listening to the speech, and we had a Liberty board meeting, and there was one of the review editors on our board, and I said, "Are you guys going to feature this?" He says, "No plans." Never did. I did the rounds at our headquarters, and they're good people. No personal problem with any of them, but the obliviousness to it was just earth-shattering for me. So, again, I forget who made the comment, don't look to you should look to leaders. Leaders are supposed to lead, but don't look to them the way Catholics say were traditionally to look to their church leaders as authoritarian, beacons for their behavior. You have to understand for yourself. Way too many, even of Adventists, are asleep at the switch. I just am certain of that. And, maybe I'm asleep in a way that'll cost me my salvation, but that's a personal matter. But as far as a responsibility to each of us to inform on such things, don't count on them. They don't see it, a lot of them. And I went to BRI, and they're good guys. This is the Biblical Research Institute. And once I went to Ted Wilson and told him that they should be treated like the Supreme Court. They're not very highly regarded, but we have a mechanism at the GC to at least examine what's going on and make a judgment as to whether it's doctrinally correct or not. But they're not got much authority. But I went and talked to them. They hadn't even read the document, and their excuse was they'd been too preoccupied with women's ordination, which I think is a damning admission. Whether or not you agree with women's ordination is sort of irrelevant, but to be sidetracked from something so in your face as a prophecy fulfilled in current events, amazing to me. But there's just loads of evidence, and I don't want to sort of list them now because then it'll get into a 2 or 3 hour lecture. But there's lots and lots of things, and perhaps the clincher that I've been on for 20 years now, but it's more important than ever. You have to understand that the religious right, which is not a massive singular group, but there is certainly a center to what you can describe as the religious right. Used to be called the moral majority, politically active, here and now sort of Christians that want to use the Constitution, they want to change the country, even bring in an Old Testament modeled type of governance. They have come under the influence progressively of a group that you might never have heard of, called Christian Reconstructionists, who, without any pretense, want to establish an Old Testament regime in this country. And they are influential. Many, many times over the last 20 years, as I read who's talking to the then president about religious matters, I see the name of their leader, Gary North. His father-in-law, Rushdoony, began the organization. But they've been very successful. They single-handedly have been responsible for creating what you probably have heard of as dominionism. And dominionism has infected the religious right. Dominionism leads to such generally right-wing statements as, it's our right to sort of exploit and to mine wherever we want, damn the ecological consequences. The earth is ours to pillage as we want. They don't use that word, but to take as we want. And, it bleeds into the prosperity gospel. I'm righteous, and because I'm righteous, God has blessed me with money. You don't have money, you're not righteous. These sort of shorthand equations. And it also has informed something you should be aware of. You can pick it up in the news, but of course it's not bannered as big as it might be. The influential dominionists, some of them in Congress, some of them the televangelists and so on, they've been traveling to Africa and tutoring friendly governments there on how to deal with things like homosexuality. And in a couple of cases, they were barely on the plane before the death penalty was put in place. And the legislators there have said directly, we got this from these people. Well, why would they treat Africa different than here? This is their plan. And I have to report to you, though, not much more than a year ago, I'd say, I saw on television one of the Reconstructionist representatives, and he said, very charitably, he said that they'd changed their mind about their penalty for homosexuality. Previously, they'd stated when they gained power, after a 6-month cooling off period, I think it is, there would be mandatory death for adultery, homosexuality, and Sabbath breaking, and they mean Sunday. But he said they'd rethought it, and as long as gays kept quiet about their orientation, they would not execute them. They're very kind people. But that's the sort of scenario that they're imagining. Whether or not they would ever get such a thing, I can't say. I don't really think so, but I am certain that their influence is growing and that it's bleeding over into general attitudes of power and authority for a righteous nation, a godly nation, that through governmental mandates we re-Christianize this country. Their inclination is good. These are people, I've met with them many, many times, especially in the previous job I had with Listen magazine. And it used to really touch me how they would pray fervently, sometimes crying that the Lord would heal this nation. But they've swapped and decided to heal it through legislative means, through majoritarian methods. And if they don't have the majority, then authoritarian. And it's an old allure. It's not the only country that sort of thinking has taken on, but it doesn't end very well. And we know how this will end. We've had a few false starts as far back as 1888, and I believe it's as quick as a couple more natural calamities before they'll be howling for some legislation to save us, from the wrath of God. I'm very surprised that this administration have gone as far as they have with in fact, I think that all that saved us is President Trump doesn't quite grasp the immensity of these disasters. He still thinks that it's an absorbent towel sort of an issue. But eventually his advisors are going to have to tell him of the real cost. There are billions, and it could even conceivably be trillions of dollars of cost for these emergencies. I know, the builders get jobs to rebuild and so on, but eventually these will just suck away, even more than foreign wars, suck away the financial health of the country.
So we are if I may, we are Protestants. And when you talk about the religious right and this group that it seems that,
and
the
it's a
administration...
funny combination of Protestants and Catholics.
That's what I wanted to ask. If you could define that, because then, according to the sequence that you described before, that is not just going to start by Rome, that is going to start with the Protestants who will reach out with, which is exactly what Ellen G. White said when it says the Protestantism will grasp hands with the Catholics. But I wanted to know more the religious right. There's not just a vacuum. Those are real people that are obviously influencing.
I'll see if I can remember the quote. She says, when the leading churches of the United States, uniting upon such points of doctrine as are held by them in common, shall move upon the government to sustain their institutions and support their decrees, in other words, state aid and Sunday laws, she says, then Protestant America will have formed an image to the Roman hierarchy, in other words, copying Rome's ways, and civil penalties upon dissenters will inevitably follow. It's pretty natural. You can support that statement by history very easily and by human psychology. That's just how it works. And it's not Rome directly, but Rome is an indispensable dynamic in us turning away from Protestantism and back to the methods of the Middle Ages.
But who forms the religious right? Who are those groups that are just so influencing our government?
I know we've been talking. Go online and you'll soon discover them. Their footprint is pretty heavy.
Okay, but
anyhow, I think we're starting to chase away attendees. We only have the right wing left, so... But thank you for your indulgence and the chance for all of us to share, and for me I can only speak for myself. I appreciate the chance to talk here and to the other locations. It's been very good. And please support not just our general religious liberty, but from my perspective, support Liberty Magazine. This is the moment. Without some influx of funds, we cannot send it out, because there is no direct allocation of monies from the church. My salary is paid by the General Conference. The office expenses and immediate office expenses at NAD are paid by the NAD, but everything to do with promoting, printing and distributing liberty is directly from this money. And we're not in trouble. I'm not crying poor, but this is the moment to do twice as much as we've done. Twice as much, 3 times. You know, why should there be a limit? Ellen White says, you know, leaves of autumn, bands of light. She used hyperbolic statements for getting the literature out. This is not the time to cut back, especially when, as the video showed, it's been very effective. Thank you.
Thank you very much.